Welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we're the co-hosts of the Dirt on the Past Museum Edition. We're here at the Museum of the Rockies E.L. Wiegand Learning Studio, and we are so excited to have somebody we both know who we've actually had on the podcast before, Anthony Wood. We're joined by him to talk about community and storytelling and new work that he is putting out into the world. So welcome, Anthony. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we usually start off by telling our listeners a little bit about you, and we've done this before, but some things are updated. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. So Anthony Wood is a historian of the American West. His work looks at race and placemaking during the 19th and 20th centuries. He completed his PhD at the University of Michigan earlier this year, wow, which is just very recent and fresh, very exciting. And now he has an incredibly cool job. He is serving as the senior historian on a new national park service project to research and catalog a comprehensive history of African Americans in the parks of the Intermountain region. This is just so needed and so exciting. Anthony's 2021 book, Black Montana, was a finalist for the Great Plains Distinguished Book Prize.
There it is.
There it is. His next writing project will further develop his dissertation entitled 40 Years Within the Veil, the Black West and Counternarratives of Race and Place in the Rocky Mountains. Very exciting. I hope I got that all right.
That was perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, but Anthony also is an artist and he paints amazing pictures of the West, and he has gallery representation in Helena, and he's nice enough to bring some of his work to my store, Mocha Boutique on Main Street.
Which
And
is just like right in the middle of the
people
gallery.
cannot believe how beautiful and affordable. I'm not a gallery, but I like stealing some of their business, shall we say. And I owe Anthony some money. So yeah, we'll be tackling that after. Yeah.
So that's
There you go.
That's
I know,
amazing.
I know.
That's amazing, Anthony. Well, we're so glad that you're here today to talk with us about some of our favorite things, which is telling stories and creating historical narratives and creating stories and historical narratives that then we interpret to the public, or we help the public understand through our lens and through the way that we see the stories. So usually, Anthony, our first question is about what brought you to your research and your interest in history and Montana's Black community. But we did a podcast with you in 2021, and we asked you that question, and you answered it so well that we're going to just refer folks back to that podcast for that question. So we're going to just move forward and dive in. And I want you to talk to the listeners about some context and briefly talk about your book, Black Montana, so the basis of understanding of how we're going to move forward with this conversation today.
Right. So I think the basic thing that needs to form the bedrock of the conversation moving forward is that in Black Montana, the main question I was trying to answer is, why is it not only that Montana had the smallest Black population of any state by percentage and by total population, as per the last census, but also that why were stories, also historical, records and documents, why were these things largely missing from our present analysis of Montana history? Was there a larger structural reason behind kind of the erasure of Black history? And the book really tried to answer that question by looking at the history of race and racial ideology in the 19th century, which is something that, I tell people today that if you think people in the United States think and talk about race a lot, it has nothing on the late 19th and early 20th century.
Fascinating, yeah.
It was the kind of the wind blowing in the air everywhere. And the development of the ideas about race and racialism are growing at the same time the Black community is growing in Montana. But then when you go back and look at that, you realize that the questions and dialogue about race in the state are actually more expansive than just a white-black binary. And in Montana, especially, it's largely a question between white settlers, indigenous peoples, still in Montana, the way that race operated within that particular relationship, and then the kind of the bizarre racial calculus of the 19th and early 20th century that moved outward. Black settlers coming to Montana stepped into, but also brought different types of questions to this relationship. So it was trying to triangulate the way that race operated in Montana of that particular moment. And the kind of conclusion of the book states that because settler colonialism, the kind of the relationship between white settlers and indigenous people, was so focused on elimination of indigenous presence, that race, especially in places where that was so ongoing and so kind of like close to the present moment, took on many of those characteristics. So there was a kind of an erasure, and I call them an erosion of Black history. This metaphor that kind of called to mind both an event that happened in the past, but one that continues to happen in the present. And you can kind of call up whatever geological metaphors you like there, erosion, sedimentation. You can see how the loss of this past kind of continues. So that being said, you could probably guess that had a lot of engagement with scholars. It had a lot of engagement with non-historians, cultural anthropologists,
Yes.
and people that are not. I'm not going to even say they're very readable. They're not very accessible to almost anybody, including other scholars. They take a lot of work to get through, and for that reason, it left a lot of the argumentation kind of buried within a very scholarly layer of the text. And I tried my best to get the stories to bring out what I thought those arguments meant for the history of Black Montanans. And I think they did well enough. But now 3 years later, I have the really wonderful opportunity from Humanities Montana and the United We Stand project to serve as a fellow over this last summer and look back at some of my work and think about, has anything changed in my research and the way I approach the study of the past over the last 3 and 4 years, finishing my doctorate, that can kind of revitalize these stories, or more precisely, revitalize the framework that actually lets the framework land with the public in the ways that I wish it could.
Okay.
And I, after writing the dissertation, which I've called 40 Years Within the Veil, the Black West and Counternarratives of Race and Place in the Rocky Mountains. I actually think there is a very accessible and a pretty frequently experienced way that the public, whether or not you are even a history buff or someone who just casually encounters it, on roadside signs or watching the news, there is a way that I think these stories and that I wrote about in Black Montana can continue to land. So that's really the impetus behind this last summer.
That's exciting. And that really takes us to kind of the next place we want to go in talking with you, is about historical storytelling in general. So the importance of storytelling, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell our families and our communities, and ultimately the stories that will be passed on to future generations that will come after us. I want to ask you your thoughts on something before we get to specifically how you are using storytelling in this work going forward. I wonder, do you see a change in the field of history in how people, how historians are using narratives and storytelling? Do you feel like, has there been a shift in the past several decades? I feel like a lot of the academic histories, when I was back in graduate school, same time as you, I found these stories in these books, not only were they academically sound, but they were written in such a way that you didn't feel like you were reading a history. You felt like he's narrative with stories. And my sense was that a lot of historians were getting it, that the way you wanted to tell the story once you've done a research.
Yeah.
And so I think that's sort of what you're saying in a way with, now that I have all this information and I have time to reflect on it, do I create a narrative structure that gets it out there in a different way? So give me your thoughts on sort of the role of that in history, as well as the role of story, what relates to your work.
Yeah, I think there's a really good segue from that question to where I would like to get for talking about Black Montana and the story.
Right.
So I agree. I think that there has been a hugely successful push at getting academic historians to recognize that there is an incredibly valuable place for the historian as storyteller.
Yes,
Um,
that's a great
and
way to put
that
it.
there is no, you do not need to step down from your academic rigor. You do not even need to suggest that your audience will change. I think that one of the, I mean, there's a ton of people I can point to. Ty Miles is the big one.
Ty
There's not a
Miles is,
single
I think we
person-
all aspire
Yeah.
to be
I-
half as good as, right?
Not
Yeah.
only does a lot of people read her books, but academic historians, the most serious thinkers in her field, read them with even more attention and you know, looking for the ways that she has used storytelling to draw out the sources, to draw out her analysis. And I think that shows that the historian as storyteller doesn't give up the historian as analyst, or doesn't give up anything in the historian as interpreter or investigator.
She's very upfront about exactly what she's doing all the time.
Mhm.
And so you know exactly where you are with what the record says and how she's doing her interpretation.
Yeah.
So she's not leaving, she's not hiding it behind anything, but it creates a much richer
Right.
story.
It does, and I think that
Powerful. Yeah.
the thing that will the main hurdle for that, and I have encountered it over and over again over the last 5 years of writing the dissertation with that like goal in mind, is that writing that way is far more work.
It is.
And it's work that's well worth it. In the process, I think you start thinking a different way.
Absolutely. Yep.
Which is what I'll
Yep.
get to eventually. But it's also like at the end, you have a book or an article or something that it's just more accessible. It has more, I think has the word I want to use is has legs. Like it will
Yeah,
continue to
yeah,
go,
yeah.
like it will last longer in
It
people's
will.
mind.
Yes.
I loved writing Black Montana, but it was very much within a moment of scholarly discourse, and that's the right way to phrase it, that it will feel super dated in 5 years, if not already, because the language was all the language that was being used by these scholars around this particular issue from 2011 to 2017. And then we've dropped some of that because we've internalized into other things and we've moved on. And now if you pick it up and read it, you might wonder, it's like, wow, this is a book or work of its time, where if I had been a better writer as a 25-year-old.
It's a master's thesis.
I know.
Dude, give
It
yourself
might-
a break, you
if I
know?
had
I
been a better
know.
writer, it might have had a different type of longevity than it currently has. So
I think that's the process of doing a thesis or a dissertation, though. And I love, though, that now as things are becoming books, that's really where grant funding needs to help give
Mhm.
historians that space and time to write a story like that
Yeah.
instead of just
Yeah.
editing their dissertation.
I found that I also needed time to read other things.
Ah, yes.
I started
Yeah.
reading fiction again for
Yes.
the first time since I was probably in high school while writing it. And it completely changed. I could tell that my brain was different when I sat down
Yep.
to write. I thought in different patterns. Yeah, it was.
Did you
yeah,
get that advice from someone?
I think I just needed it. I think I just needed
You just
to
went there
read.
yourself because
yeah,
you knew that was going to help.
yeah. So,
Bob Rydell told me.
oh, that's a very
Dr.
good.
Bob Rydell
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
Nancy, the biggest thing I can tell you, he was on my committee at the
Yeah.
time, read good writing. And it
Yeah.
doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction. And that's the advice I give anybody who's writing now. I have a friend who's working on a textbook in anthropology. And I said, go read some good writing, because what you're writing right now sounds like many other textbooks, and that's not what you wanted to
Mhm.
do. You wanted to
Mhm.
do something different. And I think it is, right. It's hard to get those patterns
Yeah.
out of your brain.
So then what happened, actually, that's actually a very good segue. As I read a lot more and as I kind of had this commitment in my dissertation writing to be thinking at least about narratives, it wasn't just that the historian as storyteller was there. I suddenly started reading sources from all over the West. So my dissertation looks at Pueblo, Colorado,
Mm.
Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Pocatello, Idaho.
Oh, wow.
And I do this thing where I spend half the dissertation studying just the Black communities of those places, and the other half talking about race within the broader, narrative communities is what I call them, the history of those same places and how they used race in the creation of a sense of community or local identity. And in looking at that, I realized that it wasn't just the historian as storyteller, but it was just history as storytelling. There
Yeah.
were so many times in which I felt that the best and most accurate way to present and interpret an event taking place in Pueblo, for instance, was to allow the first tellers of that a little bit of space, that because they were telling stories, they were telling stories about themselves, which is where I get my tagline for, the stories that we tell about ourselves have this gravity to them, and it changes and shifts over time. So I had 40 years of observing the stories that people in communities told about themselves, and in many cases, those stories persist to the present. In others, and sometimes more interesting ones, is they persist in that the identity, kind of the main factor, the moral of the lesson or lesson,
Yeah.
that story imparted still stays with the community, but the story itself, the characters not mentioned, as far as I can tell, after the mid 20th century. But the story's point landed, and it got picked up in other places, but the story itself dropped off. And I just have been fascinated by trying to follow some of these accounts of historical storytelling. And sometimes they're not historical, sometimes they're like mythic or
Sure.
But what you're
apocryphal.
saying sounds like it sounds like an event happened.
Mhm.
It was processed and thought about and told right in the recent,
Yeah.
future right after that. But then it becomes part of this larger identity, regardless of the actual specifics of the story. It becomes some of them, for
Yeah.
some reason, become this essential part of how the community sees
Yeah,
itself.
it becomes narrativized. Is
Yeah.
how
I mean, it
thought
becomes culture,
Yeah.
and so that's where I think mentioning cultural anthropologists is so interesting. And of course, that's near and dear to my
Yeah.
heart. So yeah. No, that's so fascinating.
So that's where my shift has happened from when I came back to Black Montana and looking at some of the chapters. The one that I've picked to kind of do over the summer is my chapter on kind of the Black wilderness experience. Not because I have the best stories to retell, but because I've recognized in the writing that had I been had in this mindset when I was writing this, I would have looked at certain characters in that as this is a very different kind of storytelling, history as storytelling. This is they're using the wilderness in this particular example as a character about themselves in ways different, sometimes diametrically opposite to the rest of Montanans, in their same time and place, and how they talked about the character of wilderness in the stories that they told about themselves. So that's kind of the fascinating thing that I'd like to get to, and I'm excited to talk about that.
Yeah.
We're not going to let you. No, we will get there. We will get there.
So kind of to even go back a little bit and talk about some of these stories and the importance of story within historical narratives and what gets picked up and held on to and what gets let go of and why. I think that's so interesting that you're going to be working with that. And it's so fascinating that some characters are part of those stories and then they drop off, but the story continues. So that's interesting.
Yes.
I can't wait to read more about that.
Yes.
But with Extreme History Project, when we started doing history and we started doing our walking tours, we really saw the impactfulness of the story on talking about these historical narratives. And we kind of started with our basic Bozeman historical narratives. The Nelson story, Cattle Drive is just one of them. But as we kind of started creating our own historical narratives and understanding better the more complex and broader history of Bozeman and Montana and the West, we really understood that there was so much more to those historical narratives that had been left behind, that had dropped off for whatever reason. And so we started adding those back to our traditional historical narrative. And it's been so interesting to see the community's identification with that increased traditional historical narrative. So we're not just talking about the white guys anymore. We're talking about all these different communities that participated and really helped to build this town that we live in. And that's partially the Black community, the Chinese community, women in this town, also the LGBTQ population of historic Bozeman. And so we've started really seeking out these histories, and they're really hard to figure out. I mean,
Yeah.
they're hard to find,
Mm.
we get
Mhm.
little bits and pieces here and there and kind of cobble them together.
Because they weren't the ones
Right.
writing their own histories in the same way.
Yeah.
They're not as easy and accessible to stories, but you can find them.
And sometimes those people are telling their stories like you're talking about. Sometimes they're not. So we have to like help tell those stories and hope we're doing it the right way. But anyway, so as we've been telling these stories, so many people have come up to us and said, I feel like I now belong in this community because you're telling a history that I can see myself within.
Mhm.
So and then we worked with the city of Bozeman to um rewrite Bozeman's historical narrative for their Belonging in Bozeman project they were working on. And so that is out there in the public now. And we have a lot of people who say, I read it and it was so important to me because I can now see myself in this community.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's my community now too. So it's giving them that identity
Yeah.
that they never had before, especially the Hispanic population of Bozeman, LGBTQ plus populations, the Black population. So all these people that were really significant to the founding of Bozeman,
Mhm.
whose stories have kind of fell off or been suppressed and pushed
Mhm.
away, have now been
It's a
brought
more
back in.
accurate history, and then
Yeah.
it has this wonderful effect of not only telling it better, but showing the inclusivity, the diversity, all the
Yeah.
different things, and understanding then some of the tragedies of what happened
Yeah.
and why people didn't stay.
It's a really good
Yeah.
example of what I call narrative communities.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times, and Montanans will really, if you're from a smaller town, I'm from Anaconda, which is, on the small mid-range,
Yeah.
it is, I think, should land for most people. When we think about our community identity or local identity and the stories that kind of make up the fabric of who we are, we locked out those stories into the past. They're usually stories about the past, and a usually very particular time in the past.
Yeah.
Bozeman certainly had that as well from, the 1860s through the 1880s,
Yeah.
where the stories that took place there, that crystallized who we are.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But that's kind of a fallacy. And to see that when people come forward to you and they recognize that like you have changed the temperature, or you've changed the their orientation to the question of belonging, because that's what stories and narratives are doing. They're creating those categories of home and belonging, which are not static. They're constant, they're fluid, they're dynamic, they change, and our constant retelling of our past and our historic stories changes the categories, so that when
Yeah.
people encounter a different story, the category of home and belonging has shifted a little bit. And I think of that as like the community has changed, if ever so slightly. And maybe it's not perceptible to everybody. But it is for that person. And over
Right.
time, it will change in the way that it has changed over the last 100 years. Part of writing the dissertation that was so much fun was that I got to watch, especially in the chapters on Cheyenne.
Mhm.
I was talking about a woman who wrote a large history pageant of Wyoming, which is phenomenal. It's called Vitavu. So if there are any climbers out there, the place, the big boulder batholith between Cheyenne and Laramie is named after her pageant,
Oh,
which it's a fake Arapaho word. It's kind of not, it's a Baudelarized version of a Arapaho word, which means earthborn. And it is a bizarre account of a woman in the Progressive Era Wyoming, telling state history through cultural lenses and stories. And you get to see like this is what she thought it meant to belong to Wyoming. The whole plot of the play is how this character gets to woo the beautiful woman, Wyoming, and makes her fall in love with him. And so you get to see how you belong. And it's very different from the 1920s. If you read her thesis and her play, and because it's not performed anymore, and now compare it to what you would imagine a present day Western state to be.
right.
There are huge incongruities. Some of them are would be maybe very welcome, and then many others are we're glad that part is maybe not as emphasized. But there is a difference between this is a narrative that took place in the past, that was written about and thought and pondered over by somebody, and today in the present, 100 years later, it is a very different narrative.
Mhm.
Mm.
And the fact that they can shift like that, I think is why history needs to constantly being
Yeah.
addressed
Mhm.
by every generation.
Right.
We can't just say, well, we know everything now about Bozeman and race in the 1870s. So the project of extreme history is going to have to be in perpetuity because of how narratives and narrative communities change. So
And the lens through which we see them and
Right.
how we interpret it and how
Yeah.
we
and
how-
what stories
bringing
are
that
ending at any given point
right,
Right.
versus
right.
another.
right.
It will totally change.
I mean,
as we
there
go.
people are talking about James Baldwin again now
Yeah.
because all of a sudden, like all these things he said in the 50s and the 60s and whatever, they're like going back and being like, this is still really like they can't believe these were things he was saying then.
Mhm.
And his fiction and his nonfiction are landing in a whole, I mean, there's a whole new library that opened up that's just the James Baldwin Library, I think in New York.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's another good example of
Mhm.
just sometimes things do last. A lot of times
Mhm.
they are of their time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And to bring always remembering that history is there to serve us today. I mean,
Mhm.
that's why I enjoy history because we can take from it and understand it so that we can help ourselves move forward today and live in this world that we're in today.
Mhm.
So that the past can help us with that. So so I think you gave us an example of
Yeah.
how you're thinking. Do you have any more do you have any other examples you want to talk about with this?
Well, I'd like to maybe move to the example that I've been sitting with
Yeah.
Helena,
And
so that we can
that's
move
our-
into the
it's our next
counter
question.
narratives
Yeah.
of Black history.
So
Yeah.
yeah, the last
Yeah.
time we talked together on that podcast, we did talk about this idea of wilderness, which in and of itself is complicated. And
Yes,
there's
you
a
should
lot of
listen to that.
history.
For
That's
this
a really good
conversation, you'll
one.
need
And
that
it's fascinating.
Yeah.
I just listened, listened to the
I did too, yes.
podcast. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. That's a really good podcast.
We knew all that stuff at that time. I know. I don't know what we know now. I know. I got to listen to my own stories. So, but wilderness is this invention, and that's the thing I love to be able to say. And I remember saying it once in the wrong crowd, and then I quickly pivoted to something else because I saw that's not going to land.
In the podcast, you said there was crickets. It was
Yeah, there was cricket. It was terrible. But that idea of it, so many people can relate to, but so many white people. And so the first time people often hear that, it's because they're a white person who is seeking out a wilderness experience. But, you're talking about there are all these stories of Black wilderness and that experience. And, these are stories that are somewhat different and are meaningful and persist in a different way. So let's just unleash you. Go.
Sure.
I want to hear it.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
So the way that I have been framing this idea, they're counter narratives, which helps to actually understand the narrative that they are countering. And to assume that the public has an idea of what the narrative is probably that's dangerous because different people have different ones. At the same time, though, I thought about this earlier in the summer. I'm in Helena. I'm watching our Vigilante Day parade with my son, and there are 100 floats. And an enormous percentage of them, high schoolers from the two main high schools, are putting on essentially historical events. They're recreating them on the back of the float. They're making it fun. They're having a good time with it, and you can clearly tell that their history or civics teachers have given them, these are the kind of things that matter in Helena's history.
Right.
And a really large number of floats this year commemorated the Gulch fires and the 13 firefighters that parachuted into that fire in 1949
Yeah.
and then died.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
you live in Western Montana at all, I'm not sure of how far east it reaches, but if you live in Helena, then you've been hit with it all year long. If you live in Missoula, I assume the same
Yes.
thing, because so many of those young men were from Missoula and Kalispell. So this is an example. I suddenly realized while watching this parade, like, this is a narrative. And I'm participating by watching this parade, and they all are. And I'm participating in the ongoing narrative community that is telling this particular story about ourselves. So I got really interested, and I listened to all of the commemorative events. There were lectures in breweries. I mean, it was.
So what is the anniversary this
It's
year?
the 75th of the
Okay.
Gulch
Okay,
fire.
so they have a lot going on around.
A lot going
Helena.
on.
And PBS has stuff too.
Yeah.
That people are just, there's a lot. Yeah.
I wanted to first find out, like, why is this particular fire a narrative, like the source of this narrative
Yeah.
community? Like, why is it generating this much telling? Like, why is it contributing so much to how we think about ourselves as Montanans, as people from Helena, as people who live in the West in general. And it's not probably that shocking. If you go back, you can find lots of academic people talking about it. It was an important event within the history of fire and fire suppression. So people within the fire community, as they would have been called, historians like Stephen Pine, this is your moment. Like that mattered to them for very particular reasons.
Yes.
The three survivors, it is considered that is possible the main crew chief lit a fire as the flames were coming up the hill.
That saved their
that
lives,
saved them,
right?
and that kind
Yes.
of becomes this point in the story in which fire suppression is not just like you can use fire to fight fire, but that fire is part of this broader ecological system. And if you repress it, you're not working with nature. So that existed in the fire community pretty soon afterwards, that narrative, but it was within the fire community. And then one of Montana's greatest storytellers got a hold of it. He was a young firefighter himself. He had just, finished writing A River Runs Through It. So Norman MacLean, who thinks about what his next and only next book was going to be, and he spends the next, decades writing Young Men and Fire, which comes out right after his death in 1992. And it's a it's engaging. It's also not what you think it would be. And I listened to it. I listened to it on Audible this summer, and my younger sister is a fire historian, so she talked with me about it for a very long time. And I realized that this is a great example of a narrative that has shifted over time, that still matters. The event is talked about, but how and what it means has changed. And it's really instructive because I think everybody in Montana has participated in this narrative community to greater or lesser degrees over the last summer. So I put it out there that, Norman MacLean's version of what the Man Gulch Fire is not really what we're currently experiencing. In fact, what we're currently experiencing is a narrative that's maybe much more similar to how fire was talked and written about before Norman MacLean wrote about it.
Interesting.
His version of the book is this very classic post-Cold War move where that previously the century of external threat to the state is diminished, and now what do? You turn inwards, and fire becomes a character. Nature, but fire specifically, becomes a character in this drama of these young men, this existential internal battle. And it's a story that turns inward on itself.
Interesting.
But I've watched over the last year that almost never showed up. In fact, I will say it never once showed up in most of the public broadcasting and programming around the commemoration. Instead, it turned back towards, firefighters in almost like a quasi-militarized setting where they're the front range, the first responders,
Yes.
and the frontline troops against
Decision
this.
making.
And
right. Yep.
and these young men died, and that sacrifice is very much akin to soldiers in
Yes.
war,
Yes.
which has then
Interesting.
changed what Norman MacLean thought about fire as a character back into fire as this external threat, which I think is interesting
Very.
considering the world again that has happened. So the story we have been telling about ourselves recently is going to change about how we think about our relationship to wilderness and the outdoors. But it's also kind of reflective of how we think about our relationships as a community to the communities outside of our own.
Yes.
So that was I hope that lands as a hook for everyone, whether or not you like history, whether or not you think
It
about
makes me
yourself
want to
as a
read
historian.
Norman MacLean's
know.
book.
It does.
For
I know
sure.
he's-
Yeah,
might be
no, and
able
he's
to
a
cut
great
this
writer.
part out.
Yeah, no,
I kind of suspect that he's still correct. I think we are still having an existential
Yes.
self inward. It's just
Yeah.
reflected in a different direction now.
Sure. Sure.
As I think about this all winter long, as I think about how good the snow is going to be for fire season, and then all spring about how
Yes.
the rain is going to help the fires, and then all summer I'm looking for the hills. I think I'm still having an existential.
I
think
feel
it's
like
still
we talk
me.
about
I'm
it.
just
We
projecting
talk
it
about
onto the
all
world.
time.
I know.
Don't we? We
I
talk
think
about
it's-
fire. You're right. All year round.
Yeah.
My husband always talks about it. I know.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
plenty of other things going
Yes.
on in climate change that I don't have the same existential
Yes.
response to.
Yes.
So I think Norman MacLean was probably onto something like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
So I put that out as the narrative about, this is how you can see when you hear a story in the world, when you hear historians or, people in the public telling the story about ourselves, I hope that you can hear it and say, I can see how this is a story about us.
Yeah.
Insofar as it's a story about the past or it's a story about nature. It's really about this is about our community coming to terms with its own
But
identity.
it's a bit of a heroic story. I mean, when you were likening it to,
Yeah,
you know,
it's
the
not a bad
sacrifice people
story to
make.
tell about ourselves.
No,
I don't
No,
think.
it is. It's a
It-
very
yeah.
heroic story
Yeah.
with the sacrifice that you're talking about, and then what was learned from it and
Right.
to use
Yeah.
after. So yes.
But if Norman McLean hadn't, for whatever reason, been drawn to this story and not told that story,
I don't
we
think
would not have that story.
not
in
at the
our
same
narrative.
level. I don't
Right.
think we would. I think it would still certainly exist within people who care about fire ecology,
Yeah.
and that
Because-
type of thing. But it's now, I mean, it was a
Yeah.
parade
Has
float
someone-
a dozen times over this year.
Has someone ever thought about a Hollywood script about that? Do you
Yeah.
think?
Well,
Like-
there is a movie that it's from the 1950s. I think it was Montana's Red Dawn. So you can
Yes,
hear
I've seen that
you can
movie.
hear the
Yeah,
Cold
yeah,
War echoes of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I haven't watched it recently. But it has, I think, a more recent one that might take in
Mhm.
So-
fuller
So
questions.
Norman McLean decided to bring this story into the narrative.
Mhm.
And now we still have that story
Yep,
in
and
this.
we are telling it about
And telling
ourselves.
about us
Yeah.
ourselves. So let's talk, and so he talked about fire as a character,
Mhm.
but we love to talk about people as characters
Mhm.
and talk about how people who have brought themselves back into their history and looking for those stories of people who talk about themselves and their own histories. And we have a example of that in a character from Montana's history. Her name was Rose Gordon. And you talk about Rose Gordon a little bit. And so maybe you could kind of speak to your experience in how Rose Gordon told her own history. And so in that way,
Mhm.
we're still telling her history
Right.
because she, like Norman McLean, brought the story into the narrative
Yeah.
of herself
Mhm.
and her community. Not as much herself, but her community.
Right.
So,
So
yeah.
Rose Gordon is the perfect, she's the perfect character to discuss that counter to.
Maybe explain who Rose
Yeah, so
Gordon
Rose
was for
Gordon
those folks who don't
lived in
know.
White Sulphur Springs her entire life, from 18. I haven't checked her dates recently. This is a bad history.
1883 is when she was born.
1883 until
1968.
I knew that you would know because you were working on
I'm
her,
working on it.
on her as part of the documentary, which I probably just like put too much. I'm like, they'll know more about Rose. I'm fascinated by Rose as the storyteller and the way that she also used the natural world as a setting, as a character to do a whole different type of legwork in the story that she told about herself. So I think we can start by saying, if you go back to White Sulphur Springs in the middle of the 20th century, they have two incredibly important storytellers that have shaped that community into what it is today. That is Rose Gordon and Ivan Doig, who were their primary, I would argue, especially after reading Michael Johnson's book on Rose Gordon. I think that she has as influential as Ivan Doig was for that community sense of herself. Ivan Doig read many books, notably This House of Sky, which kind of garnered so much critical acclaim and people in the area really like it. And his legacy is so important there. Rose Gordon wrote constantly. She for Ivan Doig's prestige and the volume that his work has had, she had the consistency of writing her stories that she wrote about White Sulphur Springs for decades in the local newspapers, I think did as much to shape that community's sense of itself. As
What was her her work like in comparison to Ivan Doig's?
It's really short. They're either reflections on herself. She had an unpublished autobiography called Gone Are the Days, which is actually a really interesting piece of literature that a lot of it got out into her own column that she would have for a while.
Okay.
And then I think her big contribution, which is Michael Johnson's argument, is that whenever someone would pass away or something important would happen, she would write these in memorandums about the individual. And in doing so, she would fit so much of, not just their life, but their life in White Sulphur Springs, their life in that place, fleshing it out, creating a setting and a story in which those people, now dead, were characters. And as she did this over the years, she did, 100 more times. She created a real living, dynamic, ever-changing story of the people in White Silver Springs. And therefore, I think she wrote kind of this living history of her town. And I've read lots of those. I've read her autobiography is filled with these wonderful passages in which you sense that her relationship to nature is really different than our current relationship to nature as this almost like another, once again, a foe that we're trying to conquer, whether it's climate change or whether it's just fire as being this destructive force. It's also really different from Norman MacLean's existentialism, that you need to conquer the self, and you probably won't be able to, and it's kind of the struggle in the end. And it's really different than well, maybe it's not so different from Ivan Doig. So I'll leave that for a different day.
I wanted to ask
But
about
it's
that. Do you think Doig read a lot of her work and was influenced by her?
I don't know if we know very much. Someday I think it'd be fantastic to go through his papers here at
Yeah,
MSU
or talk to his wife Carol about it.
and see how much,
Yeah.
because if he read the local newspaper when he was away, he had it delivered when he was, living and writing other places.
Yeah.
During the 30s, 40s, and 50s, he would have encountered those.
Yeah.
Right.
And they knew each other. They hadn't met.
Oh, they have.
I'm pretty sure that they were contemporaries growing up.
There's a character in one of his books that
That he used essentially based off.
off of Rose.
So
Yeah.
the way that Rose talked about nature and wilderness, you can get the sense that maybe only a Black woman born to people who had been formerly enslaved would have readily gone in that direction. So for Rose Gordon, one of my favorite passages she writes is that I think she's contemplating kind of the racial animosity of the 30s, 40s, and she thinks about her time that she spends wandering the meadows above the Smith River. And she said, and like almost a little couplet, that she sees all the flowers of the meadow, bobbing and dancing together, every one a different hue. And, this is why it can't possibly be, prejudiced, as her phrase, because, certainly nature commends the diversity, and it is in fact this, racism is the unnatural incursion that we can see in the natural world. And it's like, that's a deeply contemplative.
But that's fascinating
Yeah.
because before that and all through her life, Americans were trying to use science and analogies with nature to talk about the naturalness of racial separation and the idea that there are these fixed categories and there shouldn't be this mixing and they aren't all equal. And she's looking at nature and saying, I see exactly the opposite.
Right.
Yeah.
It is actually, I mean,
And she was right,
the
by
quote
the
that
way,
I
just for the record, yes.
She
And-
almost paraphrases in much longer, if you read lots of passages of people's account of life, the way she talks about the natural world. I'm always reminded of, it's the C.S. Lewis quote that Don Worcester quotes in his book on river empires, that if you show me someone who claims to have man's control over nature, then I will show you someone who is having control over man with nature as its implement. It's just a very different, because she kind of refused that, she got to look at nature and the wilderness and tell stories about it in a very different, along a different narrative trajectory. And this actually happens more than just in Rose's story. So I think that before I move on to other ones, people who are going to tell her story, I hope that we, over the next, decades of retelling her, because I think she is here to stay. I think she is going to be an important figure in Montana's collective memory and our past that we share together. Emphasizing her insights along those lines, I think will help, because it will change ever so slightly our narrative community on this issue.
Right.
And I think that is borne out in other examples from Montana's Black past as well. The two that I think of all the time are picnic related. So there's I'll probably forego the August 4th picnic because it has a much longer history, which I've done talks and lectures on.
Okay.
And it's very complicated. It's the Emancipation Day on August 4th, which is
Oh, right.
technically
Okay.
Yeah.
African Creek emancipation, but we've kind of lost that, and we
Okay.
maybe even had lost it by
Kind of the counterpoint to Juneteenth.
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
it's the West's
The West
oldest
Juneteenth,
Emancipation
yeah.
Day celebration, kind of predated Juneteenth.
Yeah.
Juneteenth as a popular holiday in much of the Western United States, and for reasons that are very fascinating. But still, if you go through, so in Black Montana, I loved being able to include the photo from Helena,
Yes.
the Montana Women's Club's
Yeah.
kind of a
Yes.
picnic in
Yeah.
Colorado Gulch, which I was there earlier this year. I decided to go paint outside, and I went out. And I realized exactly how far from town it was, even by my standards, with a car
Wow.
driving 50 and 60 miles an hour. I suddenly had a different appreciation for a group of people who had spaces in town. They had homes that had large backyards that could have accommodated the 20 or so people in
Easily.
the photo.
Right.
They had pavilions that they used. I mean, I've seen the notices in the newspaper for other things. Oh, yeah. And then
Do you
I have
We have an image, if
Yeah.
it's possible, to show. This is a photo of exactly what you're talking about, but this is the spot in the Gulch pretty far out.
Oh,
Gonna
we should
turn
turn
around.
it
There we
around.
go.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So it's in Colorado Gulch is now residential.
Can we zoom in a little?
and
Okay.
I realize that like there is something that happens in this 1930s moment where this group of African Americans, a large, a fairly large group, I'm guessing 6 cars. There's a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And they might have had pickup trucks that they got to load in.
Yes,
There's no
yes.
train going out there at the time.
Right.
They might have walked, but that would have taken a very
Not
long
those
time.
shoes, Anthony,
Those
not
shoes.
those shoes.
So there we
And
go. We need
white
And
their
the
clothes
hats
are.
and
That's
the
ridiculous.
dresses.
this was
Yeah.
this was an event for them,
Mm.
and they chose to go through a lot of
Mm.
effort to have that moment together, which is
Yeah.
this funeral thing
Yes.
take place as in the outdoors, in a natural setting, even more than you would get in Helena.
Yeah.
They removed themselves maybe from the smoke, maybe it was certainly a lot more air pollution in the 1930s,
Yeah.
into this really idyllic space where they gathered together, which I have
And
now.
someone must have
Oh,
scouted it
interesting.
ahead of time.
Oh, they've
and
known this.
prepared
Yeah,
the
this
place.
is a
It's
very
well-known
common
spot.
place. They
Okay.
would have liked it. They
Was
would
it
have
public
ev-
land at the time?
It would have been public land.
So there wouldn't have been anybody who said,
No,
they
so
could be
there was a lot
excluded.
of reasons
Okay.
why they might have gone and done it. And I have now been, unfortunately, on like things like Instagram, we get the resurgence of an interesting narrative, which this counters. I recognize it's the individual person that they're walking around the world.
Yes.
Day 478 of my
Yeah,
book.
yeah,
They're just
yeah.
alone,
Yep.
young white person, almost always,
Almost always, yep.
always,
Yep.
encountering the outdoors, doing the continental divide trails, things I love doing, and I often do by myself, and I understand the desire to do those kind of activities alone. But they kind of created an account, and they monetized
Yes,
this solitary interaction with nature.
but they're still
to-
sharing it, but
They're-
in a
they're
different
sharing
way,
it, but not-
in
But
time.
it's still
Yeah.
in an,
Mhm,
and I
it's a
think it's
solo
like, this
event.
is.
Yeah.
I don't see, the accounts of influencers talking about, this is me and my 10 closest friends going out and finding the time to spend together. I look at this photo, I think about the August 4th picnics, and I want to be able to say that when people encounter Black history in Montana, that we let this kind of stand as a story which commends a different relationship to the outdoors and to nature than we might readily have, always at our fingertips. It's certainly one that I think everyone would agree is like, that's a wonderful thing. I wish we had more of that in our lives.
Yeah.
And the question the historian has to kind of put to us, collectively as a community is like, well, where are we going to find
Mhm.
those stories? We can certainly make them in our present and, going forward, carry them with us. But Black history, unlike a lot of the white narratives, which we got from the 19th and early 20th century, already commends those types of stories to us, which is why it's so valuable to continue studying.
I want to ask you quickly, because I can't remember if it's in there, but who's the one who had the camera? And where did you find this image, and did it come with a narrative? Because to me, it's so important that it was documented at that time. That's a big deal to
Yeah.
have a camera out there as well as all the food and all the people,
Uh-huh.
you know?
Right.
You know, the Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs as an organization is a very robust one, as you know. And documenting their activities was somebody, I mean, it's pretty common across the country as far as I can
Right.
tell.
Right.
Certainly in Helena, we have way more photos of, everyday activities. We can find photos from the 50s in which they're, writing letters to legislatures,
Okay.
and you can see them doing their mailing
Yes.
events in someone's kitchen. And every single year that there was a conference, you have a photo of them outside the church. So this is just another one. So they have
I see.
someone who is, documenting and saving. And now, if anyone's ever in DC, the Smithsonian has the single, as far as I'm aware now, the single largest collection related to any Black Western family, which was the Heighton Bridgewaters, a large kind of network of families from Helena. And they just hundreds of boxes of
So the
of
choice,
photos.
though, to go here and portray themselves this way, to document this event this
Mhm.
way, I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
it's there's so much to dig into there. I think it's going to be fascinating
Mhm.
what you end up doing with that. And I think there's so many other interesting stories about African Americans in the West. I mean, I honestly, when I moved out here, didn't know a single one
Mhm.
when I first came out. Whereas I grew up on the East Coast where you're surrounded by everyone who doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily look like you, and you all have this complicated intermixed path, and story to tell. But out here I feel like we're just scratching the surface of
Right.
all this fun stuff.
And it's going to be essential to keep telling the stories.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I think this last summer and working through the dissertation's kind of different angle and take on these things has also maybe inclined me to think that we need to be prepared as members of our community to receive those stories,
Mhm, mhm.
in maybe different ways. I in the book, at least, I did push back against Black history only appeals to us for its novelty, for its, oh, what an interesting story that I didn't know before. And that's kind of the extent of it. It's not doing the work that it could.
Yes.
So how do we,
Good point.
as historians, how do we prepare our audiences to really hear the stories for what they could say, as opposed to just their interest? And I think that by using for my the Man Gulch fire as like, this is an example of storytelling taking place in the world. You know it, you see it, you probably maybe even thought about it more deeply than you had ever planned to, because it just got thrown at you.
Yeah.
If you can relate to that, if you can recognize that that's what's happening to you, that our narrative community is shifting and changing, that when you encounter Black history, when it comes up again, well, now you're ready to not just let it, pass by, roll off your back, so to speak, and go in one ear out the other, but let it land in a certain way, because it's, you're recognizing like, oh no, this is a story. This is a story about African Americans in the whatever time period they would be talking about. But insofar that it's a story about the past, those stories through our kind of our collective memory, how we engage with them, those stories about the past become stories about us, and not just like they become stories about me in a certain sense. The Man Gulch Fire, even though I had not really heard of it until
Right.
I was in grad school, was a story that was about me even before I had heard it, for various reasons in various ways. And in the same way, Black history in Montana is a story about us.
Yeah.
And we just need to be able to kind of steward that story and be ready for new stories when they
But
show up in
also,
the story.
don't you
Yeah.
think these stories, because there's a lot of African Americans depopulating the West at various times. Are those stories, though, have they continued into the communities that left? And are they is that narrative a part of where they settled? So
Yeah.
are there pieces of where we are out here in the West that have traveled back and
Yeah.
still, like, that's the other side, the
I
flip side of this
Just got an email, which is actually not true. I got an email early in the summer during the dissertation, I was preparing it for this committee, so I apologize to the person who I have not got back to yet. I just recently
And
headed
they're
back and
listening
started
and they're like, no,
Yeah,
back to me.
And her great grandfather was a Buffalo soldier,
Oh, wow.
and she had spent time in Montana, and that story, at least from the email that I gleaned recently, was that it wasn't talked about a lot, but its facts are still there, and now
She
she
knows
is
it.
going to go
Yes.
find it.
Yes.
So the
Yeah.
story traveled, in this case, to Alberta,
Wow.
and
Wow.
it's now in Quebec. So I mean, it's traveled far. So
Yeah.
a
But
piece of
it's
Montana,
maybe gonna come back.
and
Yeah.
I don't know what it will mean for that family. That
Right.
they will
Right.
begin and hopefully be able to start telling a story about themselves.
Right.
And
But the
that's,
story of the leaving and the
Mhm.
taking the story, I think that's as much a part of this being a part of who we are too, because there's reasons people left. And I think
Yeah,
understanding that they left, but they also took something of that experience and that history with them to shape who they became. So I think you've got a full circle. I'm sorry, but I've just given you a lot more work to do.
well, I will be doing the work I will be doing.
I think you're
It's your
right.
next book.
I think you're right, Anthony, is that we have to figure out how to make these stories stick
Mm,
and
mhm.
then incorporate them into our community.
Not just novelty. I
Just
like
not
that.
novelty,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
also incorporate them and then have people tell them.
Mm.
So our goal is that people come on a walking tour, they hear about Samuel Lewis
Yeah.
or some other member of the Black community here in Bozeman. And then when they're walking down the street with their friend and they see the house, they're like, "Oh, did you know this is the house of Samuel Lewis?"
Yes,
And he was,
yeah.
you know,
They tell it to me as
they-
did you? I tell people what I study, and then immediately this happened all last week while I was doing the painting event. People
In Bozeman?
In Bozeman.
And
I
we're
asked
telling
what
you
I
about
studied,
Samuel
and they
Lewis.
told me about
Good.
Samuel Lewis, and I'm like, this is amazing. They told
Are they
Success.
like, you know, every Black person that ever lived in Montana?
well, they didn't assume that they did. They
Yeah.
wanted to share.
No,
that
but
they had
that's
learned
so
firsthand.
exciting.
That's actually very.
Yeah,
But
that's
that's
huge.
what we want. That's what we want. So if we could have
Yeah.
them tell, the
Lizzie-
same thing
Lizzie
about
Wood.
Lizzie Williams
Lizzie Williams.
and the McDonald family
Right.
here in
Mhm.
Bozeman, but
Yeah.
what more widely, if that can come back to, come back out
Right.
as a community story, that's our goal.
Yeah.
That's our goal.
I'm excited to see what happens with the documentary with Rose, because I think
Yes.
Rose is a wonderful local figure. She has her writings and her story, and her family.
I think it's gonna
Has the
be
capacity
powerful,
to be a
yes.
wonderful statewide thing. So that you can
Statewide,
have,
anyone's gonna be able to relate. Like
so
that
that
one's
next
gonna
time,
stick. I
yeah,
think.
next time I'm
Yeah.
in Missoula randomly and I tell people what I study and write about, there is a point in which I hope that someone will say, "You know about Rose Gordon?"
Yeah.
Even though they've never been to White Sulphur Springs,
Right.
because
right.
Rose's history kind of commends herself
Yes.
to this of level of importance.
Next podcast,
Yes.
we'll check in and see if that's happening.
Yes, exactly.
I
So
know.
yeah, we're excited to put Rose Gordon in our next episode of The Story of Us, episode 2 of The Story of
Fantastic,
Us. We're
yeah.
working on it right now. I was just adding pictures into the shared
Wow.
file of Rose Gordon and different aspects of her life so that she's working on the editing and stuff like that. So
And they
it'll,
have descendants here in the
um,
area?
her brother, George Gordon, lived here in Bozeman. Tyler Gordon, another brother, was a famous jazz singer
Yeah.
during the Harlem Renaissance. I mean,
Gosh,
like
like Samuel Lewis and Edmonia
Yeah,
was, but it's interesting.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
do they still, is anybody
No.
still living in White Sulphur Springs?
No,
Nowhere
so
in Montana
none of them,
necessarily?
none of the children had, Rose never married, Tyler never married. None of the brothers and sisters had children.
Wow,
So there are no descendants that we know of anyway, that we know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
okay,
So no,
okay,
no,
wow.
yeah. And that goes back to our previous conversation on the anti-miscegenation laws,
Yes.
which were in effect most of their lives.
Yeah.
So,
Very different.
No.
yeah, and Rose Gordon
Wanna
living
learn
in
about
White
that? There's a
Sulphur
whole
Springs.
chapter.
Yeah, yeah. And we talked a lot about that on our last podcast. And then there is, you talk about it wonderfully. And we need to have Peggy Pasco
Oh,
on the
yes.
podcast.
Well, thank you, Pat.
Shout out to
Passed
Peggy.
away,
She
but
did.
you should
Okay.
still talk about
Well,
her.
we should talk
We
about
can
her
talk
book,
about
because
the
that
book,
is
yeah.
incredibly influential.
Yeah.
Like, I just think it's
I've
so
also
well
a great podcast
researched.
story because she's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
oh,
what you
it's
were.
amazing.
Yeah. So.
All right, so
Okay.
we need to wrap this
Yes, we
up.
do.
Okay.
That's all I had
okay.
to say. too. That's good.
Nothing
No,
else.
that's
That's awesome.
I gotta talk.
Well, it's been such a wonderful conversation, Anthony. Our second wonderful conversation, and maybe we'll have more in the
I hope so.
future. But so you're working on your dissertation and putting it into a book, is
Yes.
that correct?
So
Okay,
hopefully I managed while writing it to think ahead enough. We'll see what editors think of my odd structuring of it. I think that it works in a strange narrative sense. It's chiastically designed.
I have to look that
Oh,
up.
good.
It's symmetrical, so the chapters about the same towns don't appear next to one another.
Oh, okay, I like
pulled
that.
them
Oh,
apart,
I
so
see.
there's a kind of, Cheyenne is the heartbeat of the dissertation, but it's the two inner chapters, they kind of build out.
Did you say
from there.
chimetrical?
Chiastic.
Like chiastic,
Yeah.
I was gonna
Chiastic.
say.
Very, I think it's like
Okay,
a
chiastic,
very
I like
Hebrew
it.
kind of way of
Okay.
storytelling.
Very cool.
And I hope it does work, that they will allow me to continue to do. Otherwise, I will have
Okay.
to pull it apart and put it back together.
Oh, I
We
hope
will,
not, I
we
hope
will
not.
hope the universe doesn't.
That,
do
but I have
that.
other things.
Yeah, so
'cause-
what else are you doing?
So
Yeah.
besides that book, my next big project, which I hope to begin the big research push forward while I work with the Park Service, is going to be a biography of James P. Beckworth.
Oh,
So I hope that one will be a much more trade
Wow.
press kind of.
I'm so excited for
I'm
that.
very
Somebody
excited.
needs to do that, which is just
Yeah.
like John Bozeman. When we were talking about we
He
need
is-
a new whole biography of him
And
too.
if we talk about him before the kind of the end product is done, it will probably be in the line that we've spoken today, because the reason we don't have a major biography written in the last 50 years on one of the most, certainly the most important Black Mountain man in Western
Absolutely.
history,
Yes.
is because the stories told about him so fully, including the ones he told about himself.
Right, right.
And his biographer that he worked with told about him. And then my argument is that the whole early part of the 20th century, people are telling stories about him and twisting his positionality in different ways, that we have really lost the analytical ground to go through the sources to say, what can we say for sure
Yeah,
about this person? But for
yeah.
me, that is actually going to be the heart of the book. He's definitely an enigma. In fact, I think the only kind of attempt at someone writing some account of his life, I think their subtitle was like a Western enigma or something like that, which is certainly the case. So I hope to
Oh,
kind of
good.
tell his story, but then also have it kind of be a fun meta reflection on the stories that we tell about ourselves.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to drop that. That's just what I'm
Absolutely.
thinking.
Oh my gosh, that's
Good. I'm so
awesome.
excited.
And I'm also doing a painting book.
Are you really?
I'm going to do a history of Montana in 50 or 100 paintings.
Oh,
So
I
I'm
love
going to do that so I can go meet all my artist heroes.
that's
So I'm gonna,
You can get
so-
funding for those.
Oh, I'm sure.
Both those, I think. Oh my
But
gosh,
yeah.
I'm excited for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Very
Anthony, we just want to thank you
Thank you.
again so much. Always so much fun to talk to you. And thanks to all our listeners out there for joining us today. And if you love this webcast or podcast, please tell a friend. Make sure to subscribe so it shows up in your podcast feed. Leave us a review, please, so other people can find us. So thanks for listening or watching today. And we hope you can join us again to find out more about the dirt on the past.
And a big thank you to the Museum of the Rockies, Ashley Hall, Chelsea Hogan. There she's
Yeah.
our wonderful producer, Ashley Hall. And then thanks to Lawson Alegria for mixing the music. Thanks, everyone. Bye.